no stopping Jim Brown on an effort like this. He goes over the top and into the end zone for his 5th touchdown of the day.
Have you ever seen an image of strength? Like this. A picture of power. Like this. A portrait of courage. Like this. Ask yourself these questions, because the answers tell you how superhuman this man really was. Ask yourself these questions, because his whole life, that's what Jim Brown was about. Forcing the world to ask why things were the way they were.
This is Jim Brown. He got power. You ain't see nobody knock him down. Look at the film. You don't see nobody knock him back.
Devastating ball carrier in the history of football.
Any sport Jim Brown played, he dominated. His NFL career began in 1957, and he played in the league for 9 years, absolutely dominating the sport and rewriting the record book, setting a new standard for how a running back could rule the game with a combination of speed, force, and will. But Jim Brown was so much more than arguably the greatest football player of all time. That was clear when he retired before he turned 30 to become a new kind of pioneer. A black action star in the movies. A Hollywood leading man who refused to be cornered into how the world cast him. And that was just the start of the legacy he built outside the football field.
Hello, and welcome to After Further Review. Today's video is one I really hoped I'd never have to make, and while that seems completely unrealistic, the player meant that much to me personally, and that much to the identity of an entire fan base. And we're going to talk about all things, just to add some perspective, because that's really what this channel is all about, is trying to find different or the right perspective so that we can view things accurately. And one thing that has always come up in the legacy of Jim Brown is that he gets compared to people on a one-to-one basis, which is normally how you do it. But the problem is he played so long ago that most people don't have a recollection for what it was like to watch him play. If you allow yourself to really get into it, though, and try to put yourself in the position of what it must have been like to watch him play, the how of how he played, not the what so much.
You can't measure it on yards, but you got to measure it on impact. What you had to do when you faced him. This is one man, and you couldn't stop him.
You really start to see a gap widening. And that's the part I feel is lost on people in 2023 when we're talking about a guy who was drafted in 1957 and played until 1965. That was so long ago for some people that they just can't conceptualize that that player could be viewed on the same level with guys that played in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, and so on. But the gap is something we're going to focus on, and we'll come back around to that. But before we get to the gap, one thing that I wanted to use as an analogy, it's going to sound absurd until I explain it, but using a non-sports analogy, Jim Brown was football Superman.
It was almost like Superman.
Superman is the all-hero. He wasn't good at being fast. He was good at being everything. Superman is. He literally is the all-hero. Can fly, fast, strong. I mean, literally, Superman was built to be able to defeat anything. What I'm trying to suggest is the gap between Jim Brown and all of the other greats is like the gap between Superman and other superheroes. Yes, Barry Sanders, Walter Payton, Emmitt Smith, O.J. Simpson, Earl Campbell, whoever you want to list, they're all great. They're all impressive. But the gap between that group I just listed off and Jim Brown is measurable. And that's the part that gets lost. Jim Brown is better than all of them. And maybe that's a hill I'm willing to die on. But Jim Brown is the greatest running back of all time, and I do not think it's debatable. And once we get through some of this stuff, I do think you're going to, at least at bare minimum, start leaning my direction. We're going to get into all of that, but keep in mind, as we go through everything, the gap is what's important. How much better at each and every aspect is he than the guy we're comparing him to? The greatest story of this, before we jump in to the rest of the details here, but I just want to plant one quick seed in your mind. Whenever we're talking about all-time great running backs, a lot of times the same names get brought up. And there's one name in particular that commonly gets brought up in addition with Jim Brown. And a lot of times it's people saying Jim Brown's not the best because he's not even better than this guy. And what I'm about to tell you is going to put that whole argument to bed really quick. 1965. The Cleveland Browns have just won the NFL championship. Jim Brown is the reigning rushing leader. He is the reigning league MVP. He is at the top of his game, one would say. Consequently, that was the last year he'd play football, which really makes this frustrating because we've seen guys go out on top. We've seen the Elways and the Peyton Manning types go out on top. And when we say that, that even in and of itself is not the same thing as when Jim Brown went out on top. Because when Jim Brown went out on top, he was still peak Jim Brown with years to spare. I really can't emphasize that point enough. This is like if Jordan retired in 1996. You see what I'm saying? An argument could be made for someone like Calvin Johnson, because he was also similarly aged and similarly at his peak, and we all believed he had years to go. So when I throw out these numbers, please understand, Jim Brown was not fading in his ability. He was the peak player he was at that point, ever could have been, potentially maybe a little bit better, but generally speaking, he reached the mountaintop and walked away. He didn't reach the mountaintop and then start scaling back down again. 1965 is probably peak Jim Brown as we knew it, and because of that, and what I'm about to explain, should put everything in perspective about this gap I keep referring to. So in 1965, Jim Brown would win the rushing crown with 1,544 yards and 21 combined touchdowns. Yeah, you heard me right. 21. Second to Jim Brown was Taylor, who was a known commodity in the NFL at that point in time. But the third name that you'll find in that top 10 list of rushers from 1965, and I apologize in advance, Chicago, I'm not picking on your boy, but Gale Sayers. Gale Sayers had 867 yards. But that's the difference, is 1,544 yards and 21 touchdowns, and then number 2 is 900. Are you starting to see the gap now? Gale Sayers is a top 10 running back of all time. Maybe it's the popularity of Brian's song, I don't know, but for some reason people love Gale Sayers, and he will make most people's top 10 running back lists. And in this case, with the rushing crown on the line, Jim Brown fell a couple runs short of doubling Gale Sayers' number that year. That's the gap. And that's the gap that was always there. When we start looking at all the details and the how Jim Brown ran, the manner in which he ran, the intensity in which he ran, he's not comparable to any other player in the NFL's history.
Jim Brown was, he's in another league.
Brown led the league in rushing 8 times over a 9-year period.
Jim Brown, the greatest running back that has ever breathed.
I've always felt that Jim Brown's the only guy I've ever known who at 50 years old, I would have bet he could have gained 1,000 yards in the NFL at 50.
I was so happy when he retired, he ain't getting no gripes from me.
Don't get me wrong, I'm old enough that I can remember sitting on my living room floor watching Barry Sanders on Thanksgiving. So it's not like I'm forgetting these great running backs. I'm really not. To me, Barry Sanders is number 2. Walter Payton's number 3. And we can do a whole list someday if you'd like. Now, we do need to get into some more of the details, as I do want to talk about his life beyond just football. But just to sort of lay the groundwork before we get into all this. For me, what this comes down to is Jim Brown is the greatest running back of all time. It's not really debatable. We're going to continue throwing out numbers and explaining why that is. But more than that, Jim Brown, the man, I don't know that the NFL has ever had a player that was the Renaissance man that Jim Brown was. Jim Brown was born to a teenage mother on St. Simon's Island, just off the coast of Georgia. And it's important to remember we're talking Jim Crow era Georgia. For anyone who has had the pleasure of watching the movie One Night in Miami, which depicts the goings-on between Jim Brown, Muhammad Ali, Malcolm X, and Sam Cooke. And in that movie, there's a scene where Jim Brown learns again that no matter what he's done to this point, there are impediments in his way.
I just wanted to let you know that if there's ever anything I can do for you, you should never hesitate to reach out.
That's mighty kind of you, sir.
Our families go way back. Been looking after one another since the first folks settled on this island. Now, I wanted to make sure that I told you face to face, as long as I'm still here, that ain't ever gonna change.
Well, my aunt would be very happy to hear such a kind sentiment from you, Mr. Carlton. Not everyone else on the island has been so supportive.
Crabs in a barrel, I say. The hell with them all. I, for one, think that you are a credit not only to this community, but to the entire state of Georgia. I've never been prouder to say that I live on St. Simon's Island than I am now. And I would make a point of adding a place where the great Jim Brown is from.
Here you boys go. 2 lemonades.
Thank you, darling.
Well, thank you.
Sorry to bother you while you're entertaining Grandpa, but if you could come move that bureau when you have a moment.
Oh, sorry. I almost forgot.
You, moving some furniture?
Mm-hmm.
Well, you should let me help you with that.
So considerate of you, Jimmy, but you know we don't allow house, so it's quite all right. It really is wonderful to see you, son. You keep up the good work. You do us all proud.
So even going back to visiting St. Simon's Island and having a conversation with someone who reveres him on some level, Jim Brown was even reminded then, later in life, that the world doesn't see him the way it sees the majority of the rest of the population. And that would be an underlining theme in his life. And that whether he was playing at Syracuse or in Cleveland or was acting or whatever, Jim faced every single day, every moment through the lens that the public at large believes him to be a second-class citizen.
All these old stereotypes, blacks not being smart enough to play quarterback, these were the perceptions. So Jim was a dominant black star during this time when there weren't that many black players.
Gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow and segregation forever.
I was born black, but I didn't live black. I was trying to live the way that everybody else was living. But there was segregation at that time. There was discrimination. There was unfair situations. There was brutality. This country was a mess.
We played the game in Florida. When the players got through getting their keys, the only people still standing there were the black guys. The manager came over and he said, "We got a nice hotel for you in Miami." He had never met Jim Brown. Jim said, "Wait a minute. No. We're the Cleveland Browns. We don't separate. So you get keys for all of my players." And they came back and they said, "We can stay in the hotel, but we cannot go out any of the doors to the beach." And that was tough, looking out at that pretty water. But that was commonplace.
We were coming out of an era in the 1950s when the model black athlete had been established around the attitudes of Joe Louis and Jesse Owens and even Jackie Robinson, where they had to go out on the field, go on to the track, go into the ring, do their job, and then leave, keep quiet, go back to the black community, and don't say anything. Jim Brown demanded his dignity. He wanted the same respect off the field that he got on the field.
Uncompromising and unapologetic in his playing style, Jim Brown dealt with prejudice in the same forceful manner.
Jim Brown really represented achievement for the black community, and he was so good that it didn't matter what color they were, they had to acknowledge him as the best in his field. And that meant a lot to black Americans in the 60s, when everything that any black person achieved was questioned as to whether it was significant. But there were no question marks about Jim Brown.
When you're facing degradation, you can do three things. You can adjust, or you can be resentful and hostile, or you can resist and fight back. Jim always fought back. And we're better as a nation and as people because he fought back.
Anyone in Jim Brown's position has every excuse in the world to do less. But he didn't. Jim Brown never did less. Jim Brown always did more. And that would start in St. Simon's Island, Georgia. Now, after reaching the age of 8, they started by moving to Manhasset, Long Island, New York. While early 1950s New York is not Jim Crow Georgia, it's still not a wonderful existence. But Manhasset, New York is where Jim would learn to love lacrosse. And this is a big part that doesn't get talked about enough. Football is a game of certain skill sets. And over time, we have seen how certain athletes that come from different places can thrive in football. And this is a pretty important detail. Take a look at Antonio Gates, a lifelong basketball player. In every way, built like a basketball player, thinks like a basketball player, decides to play football, ends up being a very productive tight end. Now, anybody from Ohio that remembers watching Gates playing at Kent State, he was adequate. He was solid. He was pretty good. It's not like he was recruited to Duke or something, okay? So Antonio Gates was a pretty good basketball player who eventually becomes a pretty great football player for his time period. Jim Brown is the greatest lacrosse player who has ever lived. And that skill set very specifically helps in the world of American football. So Antonio Gates was good, became good. Jim Brown was the best the game of lacrosse has ever seen. And then he went on to become the greatest football player the world has ever seen. The other thing that jumps out about Jim Brown in high school was he lettered 13 times and graduated in 4 years. Yeah, I'm waiting for you guys to do the math on that one. 13 letters in 4 years. So wrap your head around this. The average person, even if they played sports year-round, most schools and situations have 3 seasons, right? You have football, soccer, basketball, hockey, track, baseball, for the most part. Now, even I went to a high school that had a volleyball team, and so you can have other things. But typically speaking, there are 3 seasons, 4 years. In 4 years, Jim Brown lettered in football, lacrosse, basketball, and track. So we're still not done yet. The math's still wrong. You shouldn't be able to do those things and get above the number 12. The greatest athlete that you have ever known has lettered 4 years times 3 sports, which gives you 12. I don't know that I've ever even heard of another athlete in the history of existence who has lettered 13 times. And the reason for that, and again, coming back to the gap, this is the difference between Jim Brown and everybody else, is Jim Brown would go run a full track meet, and then at the conclusion of said track meet would immediately run across to the other side of school and play in a full-on lacrosse game. He was literally pulling double duty, which is how he was able to letter 13 times in 4 years. It's unheard of. As a high school player, Jim Brown was all everything. He was phenomenal. You know, at one point, I think he dropped 48 points in a basketball game, averaged 20 a game. He held New York records in high school track and would go down in history as the greatest lacrosse and football player of all time. That's nuts. Just as a starting point, that's crazy. Leaving high school, obviously Jim was going to go on and play college sports. He would attend Syracuse, but it wasn't his choice. On either end, actually. It came at the behest of one of the high school administrators that told him, like, Syracuse is a good program on the rise, and you'll fit in great there. They'll showcase you, and it'll be great. The one problem was, as much as Jim Brown maybe didn't want to go to Syracuse, Syracuse didn't want him even more.
When you went to Syracuse, Jim, what was the initial reaction by the football coach when you first came out for the team?
Well, you have to understand that Syracuse really didn't want me.
Syracuse coaches actually did not want him.
So it was very difficult at that time, probably the most difficult time in my whole career.
This was the stupidest player evaluation I ever heard of. And they said, we'd like you to switch to defensive end. Defensive end? Guy's greatest running back of all time. He had averaged 15 yards a carry in high school. Can you imagine this? This is Jim Brown.
So now you've got a situation where maybe the greatest athlete who's ever lived at this point shows up to your university to run the rock for you, and you've got a coach that's living on a archaic, old-school mentality. They didn't want him. They thought they were fine in the position. They liked the guys they had. Jim Brown was basically relegated to 5th string right out of the gate. That's a sentence I can't even fathom. There's a scenario where anyone will look at Jim Brown and go, yeah, you're 5th string. And then all of a sudden, Jim Brown finds himself in a game. Coaching staff's biggest fear. He never let go of that starting spot from that moment on. That's how good he was. Even when the powers that be around him were putting speed bumps in his way and trying to stop him from being the dominant force that he was, he willed his way to show them in the first opportunity in an actual game and never looked back. Now, this example of Syracuse not being maybe the best place for him is highlighted in the movie The Express, which it's a movie that's actually about Ernie Davis. But there's a scene, we're going to show it to you here in just a second, but there's a scene where Ernie Davis gets his number. The number is 44. Ernie Davis came after Jim Brown. And this is the moment where Ernie Davis tries to essentially suggest to the coaching staff that he'd prefer a different number because he, quite frankly, is not Jim Brown.
Would you look at that, boys? If it isn't enough, they let a freshman dress in a varsity locker. Now they went and anointed him the second coming of Jim Brown.
Strong load right. 42 shoulder pads.
What you got there, Davis?
It's this jersey, Coach.
But something wrong with it?
Somebody made a mistake. They gave me the wrong number.
Mr. Davis, I put that jersey in your locker. Are you accusing me of making a mistake?
No, sir.
Well, then what?
I'm not Jim Brown.
God, I hope not. And God, I hope so. That is your number.
That might be one of the best examples of how impactful Jim Brown was. You had a coaching staff that didn't want him. You had a coaching staff that thought the white players ahead of him were better. And now you have a scenario where he is gone and he's thriving in the NFL. And Syracuse recruits the next best running back in the country. And when Ernie Davis shows up and says, "I'm not Jim Brown," their immediate reaction to that is, "No, you're not. But maybe you are." Meaning, hopefully you're not as much of a problem as Jim Brown was, because Jim Brown doesn't lay down for anybody. He's the one player I can think of in American football history who's not going to be controlled. He's not a yes man for anyone. That's a powerful idea. That Jim Brown was so dominant and so physically imposing that he's exactly who Syracuse wanted to grade Ernie Davis against.
Gentlemen, you have a thoroughbred. You do not lock him in the barn.